September 15th, 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated streets of Yokohama, Japan, where American forces had established their occupation headquarters just 2 weeks after Emperor Hirohito announced surrender. 7-year-old Yuki Tanaka pressed her face against the cracked window of her family's damaged home, watching as unfamiliar vehicles rumbled past, carrying soldiers whose faces looked nothing like any she had ever seen. In her innocent mind, she believed the dark-skinned men were simply covered in dirt from their long journey across the ocean, and that someone should help them get clean. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yuki was about to discover would challenge everything her isolated wartime society had taught her about the world beyond Japan's shores, beginning a friendship that would reshape her understanding of humanity itself. The occupation of Japan marked one of the most unprecedented social experiments in modern history. For the first time, American forces included substantial numbers of African American servicemen who would interact directly with a population that had lived in virtual isolation for decades. The Japanese people, emerging from years of wartime propaganda and devastation, encountered not only their former enemies, but also individuals whose very existence challenged their limited worldview about race and humanity. Yuki lived with her grandmother, Obasan Tanaka, in what remained of their traditional wooden house near the port. Her parents had perished during the devastating air campaigns that preceded surrender, leaving the elderly woman to care for the curious, spirited child. Obasan Tanaka had spent her entire 72 years in the same neighborhood, never traveling more than 20 kilometers from her birthplace. Her knowledge of the outside world came entirely from government broadcasts and whispered conversations with neighbors. The old woman's weathered hands shook as she prepared their meager breakfast of rice and pickled vegetables. Food remained scarce throughout the country, with ordinary families subsisting on rations that provided barely enough calories for survival. The American occupation forces had begun distributing emergency supplies, but pride and fear kept many Japanese families from accepting help from their former enemies. "Yuki-chan, you must stay close to the house today," Obasan Tanaka warned her granddaughter, using the affectionate diminutive that softened the child's name. "The foreign soldiers are everywhere, and we do not know their intentions." But 7-year-old curiosity proved stronger than caution. While her grandmother swept the small courtyard behind their house, Yuki slipped through a gap in their damaged fence and wandered toward the main street where the American convoy vehicles passed regularly. She had observed these fascinating strangers for days, noting how some had skin as pale as rice paper, while others appeared to be covered in what she assumed was mud or soot from their long journey. The child's innocent misconception reflected the profound isolation that had characterized Japanese society for generations. During the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Japan had maintained a policy of national seclusion known as sakoku, severely limiting foreign contact. Even after opening to the West, most ordinary Japanese people had little direct exposure to racial diversity. The government's wartime propaganda had further distorted their understanding of other nations and peoples. Private First Class James Washington of the 562nd Quartermaster Company sat on the running board of his supply truck, taking a brief rest during the morning distribution run. The 23-year-old from Montgomery, Alabama, had volunteered for overseas service, despite knowing he would face discrimination even within the American military. African American units typically received assignments in logistics, engineering, and support roles rather than combat positions. Regardless of individual qualifications or preferences, Washington possessed a gentle demeanor that contrasted sharply with his imposing physical presence. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders developed through years of farm work, he had kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled and hands that moved with surprising delicacy when handling supplies or interacting with civilians. His fellow soldiers often remarked on his patience and natural ability to communicate across language barriers through gestures and expressions. The supply convoy had arrived in Yokohama 3 days earlier, tasked with distributing food, medicine, and basic necessities to the civilian population. Washington had immediately noticed how Japanese civilians reacted to his presence differently than they did to his white counterparts. While most people maintained polite distance from all American soldiers, he observed additional wariness, curiosity, and sometimes fear when they encountered him. As Washington organized medical supplies in the back of his truck, he noticed a small figure approaching from across the street. A Japanese girl, probably no older than 7, walked with the determined stride of someone on an important mission. She wore a faded blue kimono that had been carefully mended in several places, and her dark hair was arranged in neat braids, tied with pieces of fabric rather than proper ribbons. Yuki had spent 10 minutes gathering her courage before crossing the street. In her small hands, she carried a damp cloth torn from one of her grandmother's old cleaning rags. Her plan seemed perfectly logical. The poor soldier was obviously dirty from traveling such a long distance, and her grandmother had always taught her to help others when possible. Surely he would appreciate assistance getting clean. The child approached Washington with the fearless directness that only very young children possess. She stopped directly in front of him and bowed politely in the traditional Japanese manner, her small hands pressed together. Then, without warning, she reached up and began gently rubbing the damp cloth against his forearm, trying to clean what she perceived as dirt from his dark skin. Washington's initial reaction was surprise, followed quickly by understanding as he realized what the innocent child was attempting to do. Rather than pulling away or expressing offense, he remained perfectly still, allowing Yuki to continue her earnest cleaning efforts. His expression softened into a gentle smile as he recognized the pure intention behind her actions. "It's okay, little one," Washington said quietly, though he knew she couldn't understand his English words. His voice carried the warm, reassuring tone he had always used with children back home in Alabama. "You're trying to help, aren't you?" Yuki looked up at his face with growing confusion. Despite her vigorous rubbing, the soldier's skin remained exactly the same color. She tried again, pressing the cloth more firmly against his hand, certain that with enough effort she could help him become clean. The dark color seemed permanent, refusing to wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. Washington gently placed his large hand over her small ones, stopping her cleaning motion. He smiled down at her with such warmth and kindness that Yuki felt no fear, only puzzlement. Slowly, carefully, he pointed to his own face and then to hers, shaking his head gently to indicate that the color wouldn't change. Understanding dawned in the child's bright eyes. This wasn't dirt at all. This was simply how the soldier looked. Her initial embarrassment quickly transformed into fascination as she studied his features more carefully. His skin was a rich brown color, darker than anyone she had ever seen, but smooth and healthy. His teeth were very white when he smiled, and his eyes sparkled with humor and kindness. "Sumimasen," Yuki whispered, the Japanese word for excuse me, or I'm sorry. Though she spoke no English, and Washington spoke no Japanese, the universal language of gesture and expression bridged the communication gap between them. Washington reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small object that made Yuki gasp with delight, a piece of chocolate from his personal rations. Such treats had been virtually unknown in Japan during the war years, when sugar and cocoa were impossible to obtain. He unwrapped the brown square and offered it to her with another warm smile. The child's eyes widened with wonder as she accepted the gift. She had never tasted anything so sweet and rich. The chocolate melted on her tongue, creating flavors she had no words to describe. Her face lit up with pure joy, and she clapped her hands together in delight. From across the street, Obasan Tanaka had discovered her granddaughter's absence and began searching frantically through the neighborhood. When she spotted Yuki interacting with the American soldier, terror gripped the elderly woman's heart. Stories of wartime atrocities, whether real or imagined, flashed through her mind as she hurried toward them, calling her granddaughter's name. "Yuki-chan, come here immediately." The grandmother's voice carried across the street, sharp with fear and authority. Washington looked up to see an elderly Japanese woman approaching rapidly, her face etched with concern and suspicion. He immediately understood the situation and slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Rising carefully to his feet, he stepped back to give the woman space to reach her granddaughter. Obasan Tanaka reached Yuki's side and quickly pulled the child behind her, bowing repeatedly to Washington while speaking rapid Japanese in an apologetic tone. Though he couldn't understand her words, her body language clearly conveyed both fear and regret for the intrusion. Yuki tugged at her grandmother's sleeve, trying to explain what had happened. "Oba-san, he's not dirty. This is just how he looks, and he gave me chocolate." She held up the partially eaten square as evidence of the soldier's kindness. The elderly woman's expression shifted from fear to confusion as she examined her granddaughter more closely. Yuki appeared completely unharmed and genuinely happy. The American soldier maintained a respectful distance, his posture non-threatening, and his expression patient rather than angry. Washington sensed an opportunity to ease the tension. He reached into his truck and retrieved a small medical supply package containing bandages, antiseptic, and basic medications. Approaching slowly with his hands visible, he offered the supplies to Oba-san Tanaka with a respectful bow that mimicked her own greeting. The gesture surprised the elderly woman. She had expected arrogance or hostility from the occupation forces, but this soldier displayed courtesy and respect. His dark skin initially startled her. She had never seen an African person before, but his gentle manner reminded her of her own late husband's kind disposition. "Arigato gozaimasu," Oba-san Tanaka said quietly, accepting the medical supplies with a deeper bow. The formal Japanese phrase expressed sincere gratitude, and Washington recognized the word from his brief orientation about Japanese customs. Over the following days, an unlikely friendship began to develop between the American soldier and the Japanese family. Washington's supply convoy followed the same route each morning, and he began timing his breaks to coincide with moments when Yuki might be playing in her family's small courtyard. The child would run to the fence whenever she heard the familiar rumble of his truck, waving enthusiastically until he waved back. The friendship deepened when Washington began bringing small gifts, not just for Yuki, but for her grandmother as well. A bar of soap, precious during the post-war shortages, arrived wrapped in paper with a hand-drawn picture of a flower. Canned fruit, unavailable in local markets, appeared with a simple sketch of a smiling face. Each gift came with Washington's characteristic warm smile and respectful bow. Oba-san Tanaka found herself looking forward to these brief encounters. The young soldier's consistent kindness gradually eroded her initial fears and prejudices. She began to understand that this man, despite his unfamiliar appearance, possessed the same fundamental decency that characterized the best people she had known throughout her life. Communication between them evolved into a complex dance of gestures, facial expressions, and the few shared words they had learned from each other. Washington taught Yuki to say hello and thank you in English, while she helped him pronounce Ohayo gozaimasu for good morning and Genki desu for I am well. The breakthrough in their relationship came during the third week of September, when Yuki fell ill with a fever that left her weak and listless. Oba-san Tanaka, worried about her granddaughter's condition but lacking money for medical care, sat by the child's bedside with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Washington noticed Yuki's absence from her usual spot by the fence and inquired about her through gestures and his limited Japanese vocabulary. When he understood that the child was sick, he immediately sought permission from his commanding officer to bring medical assistance. Lieutenant Robert Martinez, the convoy's medical officer, accompanied Washington to the Tanaka home that afternoon. The young Puerto Rican doctor had volunteered for the unusual house call, partly out of professional duty and partly from curiosity about the friendship his sergeant had described between the African-American soldier and the Japanese family. Oba-san Tanaka's initial reluctance to allow foreign military personnel into her home dissolved when she saw the genuine concern in both men's faces. Lieutenant Martinez examined Yuki with gentle professionalism, determining that she suffered from a common childhood illness that required rest, fluids, and basic medication. The doctor left sufficient antibiotics and fever-reducing medicine to ensure Yuki's full recovery, refusing any payment, despite Oba-san Tanaka's repeated attempts to offer what little money she possessed. Washington remained by the child's bedside for an hour, reading to her from an English picture book he had requisitioned from educational supplies, his deep voice soothing even though she understood none of the words. As Yuki's health improved over the following days, Obasan Tanaka experienced a profound shift in her worldview. These men, who had been portrayed as enemies and monsters, had shown more compassion for her granddaughter than many of her own neighbors had offered during their time of need. The color of Washington's skin, which had initially seemed strange and frightening, now appeared irrelevant compared to the kindness of his actions. The elderly woman began to question other assumptions she had held throughout her life. If she had been wrong about these foreigners, what else might she have misunderstood about the world beyond her small corner of Japan? The government that had promised victory and prosperity had led her nation to devastation and defeat. Perhaps their descriptions of other countries and peoples had been equally unreliable. Washington, meanwhile, found his own perspectives challenged by the experience. Despite facing discrimination and limited opportunities within the American military, he had never questioned his fundamental belief in human dignity and the possibility of mutual understanding across cultural divides. The Tanaka family's initial fear, followed by their gradual acceptance and genuine affection, reinforced his conviction that prejudice arose from ignorance rather than inherent hostility. The soldier's background had prepared him for such challenges in unexpected ways. Growing up in rural Alabama during the 1920s and 30s, he had experienced both the harsh realities of segregation and the protective warmth of a tight-knit African-American community. His parents, sharecroppers, who had never attended formal school, possessed an intuitive wisdom about human nature that they had passed on to their son. "People fear what they don't understand," Washington's father had told him before his departure for military service. "But most folks, when you strip away the fear and the ignorance, they want the same basic things you do: respect, safety for their families, a chance to build something better for their children." Those words proved prophetic in occupied Japan, where Washington discovered that fundamental human needs transcended all surface differences of race, nationality, and culture. The friendship between the American soldier and the Japanese family began attracting attention from both communities. Other members of Washington's unit noticed his regular stops at the Tanaka home and questioned whether such fraternization was appropriate. Some white soldiers expressed disapproval, suggesting that Washington was overstepping boundaries they believed should exist between occupying forces and conquered civilians. Sergeant First Class William Murphy, a career military man from Boston, confronted Washington directly about the situation. "Listen, Washington, I don't care what you do in your own time, but this looks bad for the unit. People are starting to talk." Washington's response was characteristically measured and thoughtful. "Sergeant Murphy, our mission here is to help rebuild this country and establish peaceful relations with former enemies. Seems to me that making friends with local families serves that mission pretty well." The exchange reflected broader tensions within American society and military culture during the 1940s. While the United States fought against fascist ideologies that promoted racial superiority, the American armed forces remained segregated, and many white servicemen brought their own prejudices to occupied territories. African American soldiers faced the additional burden of representing their race to foreign populations who had no prior experience with racial diversity. Their behavior and attitudes could significantly influence how entire nations perceived African Americans and, by extension, American claims about democracy and human equality. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the regional occupation commander, became aware of the situation when reports reached his desk about unusual interactions between American personnel and Japanese civilians. Rather than prohibiting such contact, Harrison decided to observe the results firsthand. The colonel's unannounced visit to the Tanaka neighborhood on October 2nd revealed a remarkable scene. Washington sat in the family's small courtyard, helping Yuki practice writing English letters in the dirt, while Obasan Tanaka served tea made from precious remaining leaves she had saved for special occasions. Harrison watched from a distance as the elderly Japanese woman treated the African-American soldier with evident respect and affection, while the child chattered happily in a mixture of Japanese and broken English. The scene contradicted everything he had expected to find and challenged his assumptions about appropriate military conduct in occupied territories. "Soldier," Harrison called out as he approached the courtyard. Washington immediately stood at attention, recognizing the officer's rank insignia even before seeing his face clearly. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Private. I'm here to observe, not to discipline. Continue what you were doing." The colonel's presence initially created tension, but his respectful demeanor toward the Tanaka family gradually put everyone at ease. Through an interpreter who accompanied him, Harrison learned about the relationship's development and the family's perspective on American occupation forces. Obasan Tanaka's testimony proved particularly compelling. "This young man has shown us that Americans are not the demons our government described," she told the interpreter. "His kindness to my granddaughter has given us hope that peace between our nations is possible." Harrison's report to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters would later influence occupation policies regarding American personnel interactions with Japanese civilians. The colonel recommended that such positive relationships be encouraged rather than restricted, citing their value for long-term diplomatic relations and the occupation's ultimate success. As autumn progressed into winter, the friendship between Washington and the Tanaka family deepened and expanded. Other Japanese families in the neighborhood, initially suspicious of the interactions, began to approach Washington themselves when they needed assistance or had questions about American policies. Mrs. Sato, who lived 3 houses down from the Tanakas, brought her infant son to Washington when the child developed a persistent cough. Though he possessed no medical training, the soldier recognized the urgency of the situation and immediately arranged for proper medical care through military channels. Mr. Kimura, an elderly carpenter whose workshop had been damaged during the war, found himself benefiting from Washington's mechanical knowledge when his tools needed repair. The American soldier's farm background had taught him practical skills that proved surprisingly applicable to urban reconstruction challenges. Each successful interaction created a ripple effect throughout the community. Japanese civilians began viewing American occupation forces less as conquerors and more as potential partners in rebuilding their devastated nation. The change in atmosphere was subtle but significant, contributing to the surprisingly peaceful and effective nature of Japan's post-war transformation. Washington's commanding officers took note of his unofficial diplomatic success. Captain Robert Anderson, the company commander, included observations about the soldiers' community relations work in his monthly reports to higher headquarters. Private First Class Washington has demonstrated exceptional ability to establish positive relationships with local civilians, Anderson wrote. His interactions have contributed measurably to the peaceful atmosphere in our sector and have provided valuable intelligence about civilian needs and concerns. The recognition led to Washington receiving additional responsibilities that utilized his natural talents for cross-cultural communication. He began accompanying official liaisons during meetings with local government officials, serving as an example of American racial diversity and democratic values. These expanded duties brought Washington into contact with Japanese intellectuals and community leaders who had questions about American society, particularly regarding race relations and civil rights. The conversations were often difficult, forcing the young soldier to acknowledge his own country's imperfections while maintaining faith in its fundamental principles. Professor Hiroshi Nakamura, a former university instructor who had survived the war's devastation, engaged Washington in lengthy discussions about democracy, equality, and social progress. "In your America," the professor asked through an interpreter, "do all people truly possess equal rights, regardless of the color of their skin?" Washington's answer was honest and complex. "Professor, my country is still learning how to live up to its own ideals. We have made promises about equality that we haven't fully kept. But I believe those promises will be fulfilled someday because enough people are willing to work toward making them real." Such conversations challenged both men to examine their societies more critically while maintaining hope for positive change. The Japanese intellectual began to understand that democracy was not a perfect system, but rather an ongoing struggle to expand freedom and justice. The American soldier gained deeper appreciation for the courage required to rebuild a society from its foundations. Winter brought new challenges and opportunities for the unlikely friendship. Food shortages became more severe as Japan's agricultural system struggled to recover from wartime disruption. The American military had vast resources available, but official policies restricted direct assistance to Japanese civilians beyond emergency humanitarian aid. Washington found creative ways to help the Tanaka family and their neighbors without violating regulations. Surplus food that would otherwise be discarded found its way to hungry families. Medical supplies approaching expiration dates were distributed to those who needed them most. Clothing and blankets deemed excess to military requirements appeared in civilian hands during the coldest months. These actions required careful coordination and unofficial cooperation from other soldiers who had been influenced by Washington's example. Sergeant Murphy, initially skeptical about fraternizing with Japanese civilians, became one of his strongest supporters after witnessing the positive impact of such relationships. "I'll be damned if I ever thought I'd see the day when helping former enemies made sense," Murphy confided to Washington during a quiet moment. "But watching that little girl's face light up when she sees you coming, hell, it reminds me why we're fighting for democracy in the first place." The transformation in Murphy's attitude reflected broader changes occurring throughout American occupation forces. Soldiers who had arrived in Japan expecting to encounter a hostile alien population gradually discovered fundamental similarities that transcended cultural differences. Japanese civilians, initially terrified of their conquerors, began to appreciate American efforts to provide assistance and establish just governance. Christmas of 1945 created a particularly poignant moment in the developing relationship. American military personnel traditionally celebrated the holiday with special meals, gifts, and religious services that emphasized themes of peace and goodwill toward all humanity. Washington had been saving portions of his candy rations for weeks, planning to create Christmas presents for Yuki and her grandmother. He also carved simple wooden toys, using skills learned from his father, who had supplemented farming income through occasional carpentry work. On Christmas Eve, Washington appeared at the Tanaka home carrying a makeshift bag filled with carefully wrapped gifts. The family had prepared their own surprise, a traditional Japanese meal featuring ingredients Obasan Tanaka had acquired through weeks of careful saving and bartering. The evening that followed challenged both parties to bridge cultural gaps in celebrating their respective traditions. Washington explained Christmas customs while learning about Japanese New Year preparations. They shared food, stories, and expressions of gratitude that required no translation. Yuki's gift, a small wooden doll that Washington had carved to resemble her, became her most treasured possession. She carried it everywhere for months afterward, telling anyone who would listen about the kind American soldier who had become her friend. Obasan Tanaka presented Washington with a carefully embroidered handkerchief that had taken her weeks to complete, using precious thread saved from before the war. The intricate design featured both American and Japanese symbols, representing the friendship that had developed between their two nations through their personal relationship. The gift exchange marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming it from polite acquaintanceship into genuine affection and mutual respect. Washington began thinking of the Tanaka family as his Japanese relatives, while they regarded him as an adopted son and grandson. Spring brought news that would forever change their lives together. Washington's unit received orders for transfer to new assignments in the Philippines, where American forces were establishing permanent bases for Pacific security. The rotation would occur in early April, giving them only weeks to prepare for separation. The announcement devastated Yuki, who had never considered the possibility that her friend might leave permanently. At 8 years old, she possessed little understanding of military procedures or geopolitical necessities that required constant troop rotations. In her mind, Washington had become a permanent part of her family. Obasan Tanaka, despite her emotional attachment to the young soldier, understood the temporary nature of military assignments. Her greater concern centered on the impact his departure would have on her granddaughter, who had never experienced the loss of someone she loved. Washington struggled with his own emotions about the transfer. Military service had taught him to accept orders without question and to maintain professional distance from civilian populations in occupied territories. But his relationship with the Tanaka family had transcended those boundaries, creating personal bonds that made departure genuinely painful. During their remaining weeks together, Washington focused on preparing Yuki for life without his daily presence. He taught her additional English words and phrases, emphasizing expressions that would help her communicate with other American personnel who might visit their neighborhood. More importantly, he worked to instill confidence in the young girl's ability to navigate the changing world around her. Japan was transforming rapidly under American guidance, adopting democratic institutions and Western social practices that would create opportunities unimaginable during the war years. "You're going to grow up in a very different Japan than your grandmother knew," Washington told Yuki through gestures and the simple words she had learned. "You'll be able to travel to learn about other countries, to make friends with people from everywhere. Don't ever be afraid of someone just because they look different from you." The lesson reflected Washington's hope that future generations would move beyond the prejudices and misunderstandings that had characterized their parents' era. Yuki's innocent attempt to clean the dirt from his skin had represented the beginning of her education about human diversity and the folly of making assumptions based on appearance. As departure day approached, the entire neighborhood began planning an informal farewell celebration for the American soldier who had become their friend and protector. Families contributed whatever they could afford to create a feast that would honor Washington's service and express their gratitude for his kindness. The celebration took place in the Tanaka family's courtyard, expanded by removing sections of fencing to accommodate dozens of neighbors who wanted to participate. Japanese and American flags hung side by side from bamboo poles, symbolizing the friendship that had developed between former enemies. Local children performed traditional dances, while American soldiers from Washington's unit contributed musical entertainment using harmonicas and guitars. The cultural exchange that evening represented everything the occupation's architects had hoped to achieve: peaceful cooperation between nations based on mutual respect and understanding. During his farewell speech, translated by a Japanese-American interpreter who had volunteered for the occasion, Washington reflected on the lessons he had learned during his time in Yokohama. "When I first arrived here, I thought my job was to help rebuild your country's buildings and roads. But you have helped rebuild something more important: my faith in humanity's ability to overcome hatred and fear." The words resonated deeply with his Japanese audience, many of whom had experienced similar transformations in their attitudes toward Americans and the outside world. The war that had begun with mutual demonization was ending with genuine friendship and hope for peaceful coexistence. Obasan Tanaka presented Washington with a final gift: a calligraphy scroll featuring Chinese characters that expressed wishes for long life, prosperity, and happiness. The elderly woman had spent days perfecting the brushwork, creating an artistic expression of gratitude that would serve as a permanent reminder of their time together. "These characters say that true friendship knows no boundaries of race or nationality," she explained through the interpreter. "You have proven this truth through your actions, and we will never forget your kindness to our family." Hayuki's farewell proved the most difficult moment of the entire evening. The 9-year-old girl had prepared a speech in carefully practiced English, determined to express her feelings in Washington's own language, despite her limited vocabulary. "Mr. Washington," she began, her small voice trembling with emotion, "you are my friend forever. I will remember you always. Thank you for teaching me that people are good everywhere." The simple words captured the essence of what their friendship had accomplished: the replacement of fear and ignorance with trust and understanding. Washington knelt to embrace the child one final time, promising to write letters and to remember her always. The departure ceremony at the military staging area drew participation from both American personnel and Japanese civilians who had benefited from positive relationships with occupation forces. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison spoke about the diplomatic value of personal connections between Americans and Japanese, citing the transformation in community attitudes that had resulted from soldiers like Washington. "The success of our mission here cannot be measured solely in terms of military objectives achieved or infrastructure rebuilt," Harrison told the assembled crowd. "It must also be evaluated based on the relationships we have established and the mutual understanding we have fostered between our peoples." Washington's transfer to the Philippines marked the beginning of a new chapter in his military career, but the lessons learned in Japan would influence his approach to service for the remainder of his time in uniform. His experience with the Tanaka family had reinforced his belief in the power of individual actions to transcend institutional barriers and create positive change. The correspondence between Washington and the Tanaka family continued for several years after his departure from Japan. Letters traveled slowly across the Pacific, carrying news about daily life, career developments, and family milestones that maintained their emotional connection despite geographical separation. Yuki's letters, initially written in broken English with her grandmother's help, gradually became more sophisticated as her education progressed. The Japanese school system's adoption of English language instruction, partly influenced by American occupation policies, gave her opportunities to develop communication skills that would serve her throughout life. Dear Washington-san, one of her letters began, using the Japanese honorific that expressed respect and affection. I am now 11 years old and in middle school. My teacher says I speak English very well because I had a good first teacher. I still have the wooden doll you made for me, and I tell all my friends about my American soldier friend. Washington's replies provided updates on his military service and growing involvement in civil rights activities that were gaining momentum throughout American society. His experiences in Japan had strengthened his commitment to fighting racial discrimination and promoting international understanding. The letters also carried news about broader developments in both countries. Japan's economic recovery exceeded all expectations, transforming the devastated nation into a prosperous democracy within a single generation. The United States struggled with internal conflicts over civil rights and racial equality, movements that would ultimately fulfill many of the promises Washington had discussed with Professor Nakamura. In 1952, Washington completed his military service and returned to Alabama to pursue civilian career opportunities. His experience with cross-cultural communication led to employment with international development organizations that provided assistance to developing nations throughout Asia and Africa. The skills he had developed while working with Japanese civilians proved invaluable in his new profession. Washington's ability to establish trust across cultural boundaries made him an effective representative of American humanitarian efforts in countries where previous colonial experiences had created suspicion toward Western motives. Yuki, meanwhile, excelled in her studies and eventually earned admission to Tokyo University, where she majored in international relations with a focus on American-Japanese diplomatic history. Her childhood friendship with Washington had sparked a lifelong interest in promoting understanding between nations through personal connections and cultural exchange. In 1958, 13 years after their first meeting, Yuki traveled to the United States as part of a student exchange program designed to strengthen ties between Japanese and American universities. Her first stop was Montgomery, Alabama, where she had arranged to meet Washington for the first time since his departure from Japan. The reunion took place at the small church where Washington served as a deacon, surrounded by members of the African American community who had heard stories about his Japanese friends for more than a decade. The young woman who embraced Washington bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old girl who had tried to clean his skin with a damp cloth, but her smile remained exactly the same. "Washington-san," Yuki said in perfect English, "I have come to America to learn about your country, just as you taught me about mine when I was small." The conversation that followed lasted several hours, covering years of separation and the dramatic changes both had experienced during the intervening period. Yuki had become a poised, educated young woman with ambitious plans for her future career in diplomacy. Washington had evolved into a respected community leader who combined international development work with growing involvement in civil rights activism. Their reunion coincided with the early stages of the American Civil Rights Movement, when African Americans throughout the South were challenging segregation laws that had been enforced since the end of Reconstruction. Washington's international experience had given him unique perspective on the struggle for racial equality, reinforcing his conviction that prejudice was a learned behavior that could be overcome through education and personal contact. Yuki's presence in Montgomery created unexpected opportunities for cultural education that benefited the entire community. Local residents, both black and white, had rarely encountered Asian visitors, and her friendship with Washington provided a natural bridge for conversations about race, identity, and international relations. During her week-long stay, Yuki spoke at schools, churches, and community organizations about Japanese culture and the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States. Her presentations emphasized themes of reconciliation, mutual understanding, and the possibility of transforming enemies into allies through patience and goodwill. 13 years ago, my country and yours were at war, she told one audience at a high school assembly. Today, we are strong allies and partners in promoting peace throughout the world. This transformation happened because individuals chose to see beyond hatred and fear to discover our common humanity. The message resonated particularly strongly with African American audiences who were fighting their own battles against institutionalized discrimination. Yuki's story demonstrated that social change was possible even when progress seemed impossibly difficult. Washington accompanied Yuki on visits to other American cities during her exchange program, serving as cultural interpreter and facilitator for her educational presentations. Their joint appearances at universities, civic organizations, and religious institutions created powerful examples of international friendship overcoming historical animosity. At Howard University in Washington, D.C., Yuki addressed an audience of African American students who were preparing for careers in international relations and civil rights law. Her presentation focused on the role of individual relationships in creating broader social transformation. The friendship between Washington-san and my family began with a child's innocent mistake, she told the students, but it grew into something that changed our entire neighborhood's understanding of America and Americans. Each of you has the power to create similar transformations through your own choices and actions. The tour culminated with a visit to New York City, where Yuki and Washington attended a United Nations session focused on international peacekeeping and cultural exchange. The experience reinforced both individuals' commitment to promoting global understanding through personal diplomacy and cross-cultural communication. Their friendship had evolved from a chance encounter between a Japanese child and an American soldier into a lifelong partnership dedicated to advancing international cooperation and racial equality. The lessons learned during those early months in occupied Yokohama continued to influence both of their careers and personal philosophies. After returning to Japan, Yuki pursued graduate studies in international law before joining the Japanese Foreign Ministry as a cultural attaché specializing in American relations. Her first assignment took her back to the United States, where she worked to expand educational exchange programs and cultural cooperation initiatives. Washington's career path led to increasing prominence in civil rights organizations and international development agencies. His experience in Japan had taught him that lasting social change required both institutional reform and personal transformation at the individual level. In 1963, both friends participated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Yuki attended as part of a Japanese delegation observing American civil rights developments, while Washington marched with veterans organizations supporting racial equality. The event represented a culmination of the journey both had begun 18 years earlier in Yokohama. The little girl who had tried to clean a soldier's skin and the young man who had responded with patience and kindness had both dedicated their lives to overcoming the ignorance and prejudice that created such misunderstandings. During the 1970s, Washington established a foundation dedicated to promoting cross-cultural understanding through educational exchange programs. The organization provided scholarships for African American students to study in Asia and brought Asian students to historically black colleges and universities in the United States. Yuki, by then a senior diplomat with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, served on the foundation's International Advisory Board and helped design programs that replicated the positive experiences she and Washington had shared during their first meeting. Our friendship began with a moment of innocent confusion that could have created embarrassment or anger. Yuki reflected during a foundation fundraising event in 1975. Instead, it became the foundation for a lifetime of working to help others discover the common humanity that connects all people regardless of race, nationality, or cultural background. The Foundation's work expanded throughout the following decades, eventually operating programs in more than 20 countries and providing educational opportunities for thousands of young people. Each scholarship recipient learned about the Foundation's origins in the friendship between a Japanese child and an African-American soldier who had chosen understanding over prejudice. Washington's granddaughter, Keisha, became one of the Foundation's success stories when she received support to study international relations at Sophia University in Tokyo during the 1990s. Her experience in Japan, guided by Yuki, who had become an honorary family member, inspired her to pursue a career in international law and human rights advocacy. The cycle of cross-cultural understanding and friendship had come full circle, with a new generation building upon the Foundation, established by their grandparents' unlikely relationship in post-war Yokohama. In 2005, 60 years after their first meeting, Yuki and Washington were invited to speak at a conference commemorating the end of World War II and the success of Japanese-American relations. Both were in their 80s by then, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. When people ask me about the secret to lasting international cooperation, Washington told the audience, I always tell them about a 7-year-old girl who tried to help a soldier get clean. She taught me that most misunderstandings come from ignorance, not malice, and that patient education can overcome even the deepest prejudices. Yuki's response emphasized the transformative power of individual relationships in creating broader social change. Our friendship began with my mistake, but it grew into something that influenced both of our entire lives. If one chance encounter between strangers can create such lasting impact, imagine what we could accomplish if we all committed to building bridges across cultural divides. The conference attendees, representing dozens of countries and cultures, responded with sustained applause for the elderly pair whose story embodied the conference's themes of reconciliation and international cooperation. James Washington passed away in 2008 at the age of 86, surrounded by family members and friends from around the world who had been influenced by his example of patient, persistent bridge building across racial and cultural boundaries. Yuki Tanaka, by then retired from diplomatic service but still active in educational exchange programs, delivered the eulogy at his memorial service in Montgomery. She spoke about the profound impact their friendship had created, not just for themselves, but for countless others who had learned from their example. Washington-san taught me that true friendship requires the courage to see beyond surface differences, to discover the common heart that beats in every human being, she said through tears that reflected 63 years of genuine affection and mutual respect. His legacy lives on in every person who chooses understanding over fear, friendship over hatred. The memorial service drew participants from across the globe, former scholarship recipients, diplomatic colleagues, civil rights activists, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Washington's gentle wisdom and persistent dedication to human equality. Yuki continued the Foundation's work for several more years, ensuring that its educational programs would survive to benefit future generations. She established endowments that guaranteed permanent funding for scholarships and cultural exchange initiatives that reflected the values she and Washington had shared. In 2012, at the age of 74, Yuki published a memoir titled The Dirt That Wouldn't Come Clean, a friendship across cultures that became an international bestseller and required reading in many international relations and cultural studies programs. The book detailed not only her personal relationship with Washington, but also the broader historical context that had made their friendship both unlikely and significant. She examined how individual relationships could influence larger social movements and international diplomacy, using their story as a case study in the power of personal connections to overcome institutional barriers. Educational institutions around the world began incorporating their story into curricula focused on conflict resolution, cross-cultural communication, and international relations. The simple tale of a child's mistake and a soldier's patience became a powerful teaching tool for demonstrating how understanding could replace prejudice through patient education and genuine human connection. Yuki Tanaka died peacefully in her sleep in 2015, exactly 70 years after her first meeting with James Washington. Her final written work, completed just weeks before her death, was a letter to future generations of students who would benefit from the Foundation's programs. Remember that every person you meet carries within them the capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty, she wrote. Your choice to approach others with curiosity rather than fear, with patience rather than judgment, can influence which capacity they reveal to the world. The friendship that began when I tried to clean the dirt from a soldier's skin proved that even the smallest acts of human connection can create changes that last for generations. The Foundation, established by Washington and guided by Yuki, continues to operate today, providing educational opportunities and cultural exchange programs that have benefited more than 50,000 students from every continent. Each scholarship recipient learns about the Foundation's origins and the remarkable friendship that inspired its creation. At the Foundation's headquarters in Montgomery, a bronze statue depicts a young Japanese girl reaching up to touch the outstretched hand of a tall African-American soldier. The inscription reads, "True understanding begins with the courage to reach across all differences in search of our common humanity." The statue serves as a permanent reminder that the most profound changes in human relations often begin with the simplest acts of kindness between individuals who choose to see beyond surface differences to discover the fundamental dignity that connects all people. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.